All right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Colby Morberg. I'm an associate professor of soil science in the Department of Agronomy at Kansas State. And we have a two-part talk for you today. I'm going to be doing the first half, and I'm going to discuss two different textbook products I created within Pressbooks and how I use those for student engagement. And then following me will be Mickey Tobler, who'll be talking about his textbook built in RStudio. All right, so for my part, I'm going to first give you guys some links to a lab manual that I built in Pressbooks, and then I'll give you a Pressbooks walkthrough for those of you that haven't been exposed to Pressbooks yet. And then after that, we'll talk about how I sort of facilitated student engagement using the lab manual, and then I'll also talk about an annotated bibliography textbook that I built in Pressbooks and some ways we did student engagement with that project. All right, so here are the links, but I'm also going to put them into the chat. So I got a whole bunch of links that are going in there right now. This is the cover of the lab manual. So this is version 2.0. I published the initial one back in 2017. And at that point, it was actually just a Word document that I created as a PDF. And it did the trick, but it wasn't quite as functional as I was hoping. And once I learned more about Pressbooks, I decided to go back and redo the whole manual and build it out within Pressbooks. And I've been really pleased with it since then. So the second link that you guys have, this Pressbooks webbook, you're welcome to click on that and kind of explore it as I talk about the manual. All right, so let me switch screens real quick. All right, so what you're seeing now is the actual Pressbooks or one of the chapters. I'm going to switch to the home page for it real quick. So this is the landing page for the Pressbooks version of the lab manual. And so all Pressbooks home pages look like this. And if you, some of the main things that you see is a short description, the license. You can download copies from Pressbooks directly. And then as you scroll down, you see the entire table of contents. And I have mine broken into parts as well. And then there's book information, authors, licenses, a more thorough book description. And there's also metadata related to the book as well. So a lot of content on the landing page. And what I'm going to do is actually go to one of the chapters just to show you what it actually looks like. So here's Lab 7, which my students will actually be doing next week. It's a lab on soil texture and structure. And how I've designed it is we use a series of colored text boxes, and we use a consistent coloring for each type of text box in each chapter. So we start with a green one for learning objectives, there's orange one for materials, purple for recommended reading, and then a pre-lab assignment, which is sort of like recommended questions that we want them to use as a review. And then each chapter has an introduction that kind of goes over the main points they should know going into the lab. And then and as you can see, there's quite a few tables that are all numbered, and there's figures that each have captions. All these have alternative text as well. And one thing I want to point out is, as a lab manual, laboratories or laboratory courses are inherently interactive, or at least they should be. And so my goal with the lab manual was to basically make it so that the manual itself would not distract from the activities in class. I just am using it to facilitate it. And one of the things I use is these little shovel icons that indicates to the students that there's actually something they need to fill out in the manual. So in this case, there's a partially filled out table that they needed to complete for this particular activity. And just kind of keep scrolling. There's lots of figures, lots of tables. One thing I want to point out is Pressbooks does use LaTeX for formatting equations. And so all these equations on the front end, they display really well. On the back end, it looks like a bunch of kind of gibberish, but I really like how everything formatted within that context. So then at the very end, sorry for all the scrolling, but at the very end, I end each laboratory chapter with a reference to an assignment that the students do that's graded for that particular class. So I'm going to go to the back end just so you guys can see what it's like to actually put one of these things together. And you can go to organize, and I'm going to go to that same chapter texture and structure. And those of you that either have or still do blog with WordPress, Pressbooks is actually a spin-off of WordPress. So it's the same user interface. And so you're probably pretty familiar with a lot of the ways we can actually format text and content within these chapters. It's all the same as making a blog post in WordPress. So that's, I formerly blogged with WordPress, and I thought it was really pretty easy to use. So on the back end, I mean, it looks pretty much the same. The one difference is we can get into the nitty-gritty with HTML. So I just switched from visual to text, and you can see all the code that's kind of built behind it. So now I have one sort of quick last note I want to talk about for the organization, or maybe two. So I'm in the organized panel now, and I can, for every single chapter, I can have it so that the chapter shows in the web, so on the web book, or I can have it show in exports. And I bring that up because for a lab manual, I actually wanted to have an instructor copy of the manual for my TAs. And so at the very end, I actually have a duplicate of every single chapter where I've made an instructor copy, and all the things that the students have to fill out, they've already been filled out for the instructor. And so I have those hidden so students can't get access to it, but I can export those just by clicking the show in exports. And I've produced a PDF that all instructors that have adopted this manual can use. And related to those exports, I'll just quickly show you the export function. So there's lots of different options. You can do PDFs that are optimized for print, PDFs for digital distribution, EPUB, and there's Common Cartridge, which is going to allow us to integrate Pressbooks with Canvas, which is the learning management system that K-State uses. And there's also some other formats. So that's my real quick kind of tour of Pressbooks. So I'm going back to my slides here. So some of the key takeaways that I've found is that laboratory courses are, again, they're already interactive. And my main goal was to prevent the manual from being a distraction. I want it to be easy to use, easy to navigate. I want the students to have as many formats as possible. And so Pressbooks really kind of helps set that up. I also think that we need an appropriate design theme. And so Pressbooks has multiple themes we can use that sort of give it a default nice looking design. And some of them are set up just for textbooks. So keep that in mind. I made an extra effort to keep the design consistent and efficient. So I use the colored text boxes text boxes, like I showed you all. And I use the shovels to indicate action items for the students. LaTeX made the equation formatting really helpful. And with all the captions for tables and figures, I wanted to make sure the captions were useful and that they're all numbered as well. So again, we want it to be useful and not a distraction. And then you can also use text styles to make all the headings and all the different formatting, just like you would in a Word document. One thing I do recommend for lab manuals is to actually keep the manual separate from any handouts that the students would actually be turning in. So I know some lab manuals are set up where you fill out the lab, you pull out you rip out a page and you hand that into the teacher. What I try to do is kind of treat the lab manual like a textbook, where the students keep everything that's in the manual. And then anything they would actually turn in, I provide a printed handout for them in class. And again, make all content accessible. Pressbooks makes it really easy to kind of make sure that you have alternative text for figures. And there's some workarounds for working with screen readers to make it really kind of seamless. Now, I have another project I want to do a quick overview with as well. And that is an annotated bibliography that I made with my students in a higher level class called Soil and Water Conservation. And so those links are already in the chat as well. Now, the thing that was unique about the annotated bibliography is I use what I call open pedagogy. And if you look in the literature, there's a couple different definitions. These authors here describe open pedagogy as activities that enable students to become content creators. So in the process, they are becoming teachers in their own learning process, which I appreciate. And also, Wiley and Hilton created a categorization for assignments, everything from disposable assignments that are read by the instructor once, they're graded, students get feedback, and then that assignment never sees the light of day again. Whereas the other end of the spectrum, we have renewable assignments where the students are creating something that has value to other people beyond the scope of that class. And so developing textbooks with students sort of fits both of these. So it's a renewable assignment that uses open pedagogy. And so that was sort of a mindset going into developing this annotated bibliography. Now, what I did is I had students write an annotated bibliography as an assignment in the class, and they were able to choose topics from a list, and from those topics, I taught them how to search for relevant content to include in their annotated bibliography, how to evaluate the credibility of that content, how to cite resources using Zotero, which is an open source citation management software, and also how to write nice, concise, well-written annotations. What was interesting with this project is that the students' biggest concern was that they didn't want to be explicitly identified with the content they created, which was kind of interesting. So they were sort of shy about being judged on their writing abilities. And so what we did is we worked as a class to sort of alleviate that. And if you look at the right side of the screen, you can see what one of these chapters looks like. And all these students or all these co-authors for this chapter are students that were in the course, and they've submitted topics relevant to this chapter topic. And it was all sort of included in the book. But what we ended up doing was I would grade their assignment, give them feedback on it, and then their final submission for that annotated bibliography, I would edit the citations, I would edit the content in the annotations, and I would do that across the entire book so that there was a consistent voice. And then from there, I handed it over to a technical editor that looked through the grammar and made sure all of my edits were all appropriate. So in the end, there was 2 rounds of revisions with 2 separate editors. And then the students were also identified as chapter co-authors, as opposed to linking one section of the chapter with one particular author. And so the students thought that was the best way to kind of approach their shyness, I guess. And what I like about this book is that we can add more content each year by having students address more topics for the annotated bibliography. So some of the suggestions I have for this sort of approach for developing a book, developing a textbook with students is, or at least for annotated bibliographies, you need to help students identify a suitable topic that's not too narrow or too broad, and also model the activity for them. So show them what a good annotation looks like, how to properly cite materials, and so on. And also be very transparent about licensing, editing, how they're going to be attributed for their work, allowing them to opt out if they don't want to have their content included. And one thing that was a unique sort of curveball for annotated bibliography is that screen readers do not work well with URLs. And so I had to use some HTML code called an ARIA label that would basically tell a screen reader some alternative words to say in place of having a long string of characters. So that was kind of the workaround for still including those URLs in the book. I do recommend this book on the right. This is sort of the inspiration for doing this project, a guide to making open textbooks with students. So it's a good book to check out. So there are my references, and see if I open up to questions. Is there, Brenda, you have any questions from the chat you want me to answer?
Yeah, I was going to say there was a discussion back and forth about what exactly is Breastbook. So if you can tell us more about what that is it a complete textbook? It doesn't, and so can it be viewed in a browser?
Yeah, so Pressbooks, so Pressbooks is a I missed kind of an important point, I guess. Pressbooks is a web-based book creation tool, I guess, and so it was initially developed by bloggers that wanted to take their blog posts and turn them into books. And so that was sort of the inspiration. And since then, they've sort of geared it towards its creation of open textbooks. And so you can take this, all these chapter content and build it out into a single book. And it creates a web book version that I sort of gave you guys a tour of. But it also allows you to export it as a PDF or ebook formats like Mobi. So that's in a nutshell what Pressbooks is.
And is that, because somebody asked, And they're curious if K-State has an institutional membership with Pressbook. Is that
they
something
do.
Okay.
Yeah, K-State does have an institutional membership, and they just upgraded it, I think, because there's a lot of instructors like me that actually want to integrate Pressbooks with Canvas. And so I think I believe that took like kind of one level up in our institutional membership. But yeah, we do have an institutional membership though.
I'm glad you mentioned the inclusion, because somebody actually asked, does it integrate with other LMS systems such as Blackboard and that they use at FHSU?
Yeah, I am not aware if it integrates with Blackboard. So yeah, you have to check with Pressbooks on that, but I know it does with Canvas.
Okay, great. So that's something for the person to check out. The other thing that they asked was, this looks very labor intensive. I wonder how much time it would take to do something like a lab manual.
It is, yeah, it's a labor of love. So luckily, I actually started the lab manual. Actually, I didn't start it initially. So when I began at K-State, my predecessor had a commercial lab manual that he created, and it was $165 a copy for a lab manual, which was excessive. And it cost more than the course textbook did at the time too. And so I reached out to my co-author, David Krause at North Carolina State, who I TA'd for when I was a grad student, using a free lab manual that they provided to their students at NC State. And so I adapted their copy, and I added chapters, took some chapters out. I reworked a bunch of the chapters, and that's why we call it the Soils Laboratory Manual K-State Edition, as opposed to the North Carolina State Edition. So I wasn't starting from scratch, so that helps quite a bit. But yeah, there was labor that went into the initial adaptation, and labor that went into building it out in Pressbooks. And I did hire an undergrad to help me with a lot of the formatting, particularly with all the LaTeX equations.
Great. And the question that I have here also, somebody asked, did you use any of the library resources, librarians, in doing the annotated bibliography?
Did I work with librarians
yeah, librarians or use library resources in doing the annotated bibliography?
Yeah, so actually the idea for the annotated bibliography sort of came from a discussion with one of the or with several of the librarians here at K-State, so our Center for the Advancement of Digital Scholarship. So I had ideas on how to make alternative textbooks, and we decided that it might actually be a good product to develop an annotated bibliography that might add more context to using all these other resources that were available to us related to soil and water conservation.
Great, thank you so much. I don't see any other questions, but definitely now we're going to hear from our next speaker. But if we have time at the end, please feel free to ask questions. So now, welcome to our second speaker.
Hi, thank you. My name is Mickey Tobler. I'm a professor at K-State as well in the biology department. And I went through kind of my first open textbook experience over the past year, and I was just going to tell you a little bit about my journey and how the students are interacting with the resource I've created. I've created this for my evolution course. This is a class I've been teaching for almost 10 years. And so I'm using the word evolution a lot, but you can essentially just insert whatever your field of expertise is in many of these contexts. The first thing that I kept scratching my head on is like, well, does it really need another evolution textbook, right? There's so many fantastic textbooks out there in evolution, and probably in all of your all fields as well. And while I really appreciate these books as kind of reference books to go back to looking up basic concepts and examples, the financial burden on students is real. And one of my primary motivations of moving to an open source textbook was really to kind of mitigate some of that financial burden. And I would argue, if the books are really good and aligned with class, they're great. But the reality is that these textbooks often are not perfectly aligned with our classes. They're really information dense, and that information density can cause more confusion than clarity sometimes in students, kind of trying to figure out what's really the relevant content that I need to focus on. And that can just be general misalignments between books and lectures. I've faced this in other courses where you only use a fraction of the textbook, and it causes just frustrations among the students. And so a couple of years ago, I applied for a grant through the Open Textbook Initiative at K-State. They gave me one. And so I had to basically, come up with a solution to my problem. Before I tell you what that solution is, I want to tell you a little bit about the philosophy of my class. Because the course is officially on the book as a lecture class, but it's really an active learning environment. That the philosophy of the course is very much that you learn about science by doing science. And so every unit in this course has kind of three cornerstone, one that's building on theory. So I want students to learn how to frame hypotheses in the context of established theory, to explain natural phenomena. The other cornerstone is really evidence. So I want students to learn what kind of approaches, what lines of evidence do scientists use, right, to make inferences, in this case about evolution. How do we test hypotheses in this field? But third, and probably most importantly, I want them to practice approaches like an evolutionary biologist would. And because, evolutionary biology does not often lend itself to kind of clear lab exercises where you can run a little experiment. And the approach I have taken to this is that I teach students how to program in R. R is a statistical computing language. It's really good for data analysis and data visualization. And essentially, I expose students to kind of classical or interesting data sets that I find in the literature where they have to visualize data and they have to make some inferences and offer their interpretation in writing every week. And that's essentially facilitated also through group discussions where we discuss their findings. So a real challenge that I've had over the years is how do I unite, on the one hand, kind of these field-specific information about evolution, and then kind of this technical information about learning how to program in R. And so my first attempt was at an open source learning resource was trying to kind of cobble together existing resources that exist on the one hand on the R side, that resources that teach people how to program, and then resources on the student side. And fairly quickly, I experienced some roadblocks. While the R resources were really mostly free, there's lots of excellent textbooks that you can download for no money. They also require quite a bit of computational knowledge, and they're not really good at picking up students at the level that I'm working with. So that was one issue. And then on the other hand, for the evolution side, there's also quite a fair bit of information out there, but they tend to be really focused on introductory biology. So that all the free resources that were available, they were really not at the level that I would expect for a specialized course in that field. So what I've learned pretty quickly is that some things just don't mix. So the existing resources that I could find, I couldn't just cobble them together. So about a month or 6 weeks into my journey, I had to shift gear, and I decided to write an entire textbook from scratch, which was one of the best and one of the worst decisions I have made in my life. But in hindsight, it has been a really satisfying journey. I have initially spent quite a bit of time trying to figure out what platforms might work for me. And I've decided not to use Pressbook or OpenStax or a lot of other commonly used platforms. And mostly that had to do with the fact that I had to, for better or for worse, write quite a bit of code in R in order to teach my students to do that. And the kind of the compatibility of R and some of these other platforms was just not great. It was more work for me than I like. So I decided that I would write the entire textbook in R, which is the same programming language the students essentially learn to use. And you can see basically a snippet of the code here. R allows you to write just regular text That's what you see in these sections right here. You can format text using language called Markdown. It's really easy to learn. For example, those asterisks you see around words, they are simply the symbol to make things cursive. The big advantage here is that I can do things like, for example, import a data set and write some code to insert a graph or a figure directly into the code. Ours really also amenable to using HTML as a way to, for example, to embed pictures or interactive videos into your open source open learning resource. And as Colby said, for WordPress, you can simply use tech to format things like mathematical equations. That's something you see on this code block right down here. So it's super versatile. I will not lie, there's also a fairly steep learning curve, but once you kind of get the hang of it, it becomes a really kind of versatile resource where you can integrate lots of different things, from kind of raw data sets to YouTube videos, anything you like. And then once you have all that, the outputs are generated automatically as HTML, PDF, or EPUB. So that's what you can see here, simply a screenshot of chapter 2 of the book. Like Colby, I will post a link here in the chat. But it's essentially a way, or you have lots of ways of exports, lots of styles to export your resource to. If you click on the link, you'll see on top you have this symbol A. This is essentially a way to change the font styles, font colors, background, you name it, font size as well. So students can really, depending on accessibility issues they might have, they can automatically change the look of their version the way they want. What you'll see on the website too is that actually you will not find a PDF or an EPUB version, and you can do this. I chose not to do it simply because I didn't want to mess with lots of those settings. And one of the biggest challenges I face is finding actually the data sets, the illustration, the photos, to give it a real textbook feel. I think one of the big advantages of these expensive textbooks is that there's a lot of illustrations. And I think that's, besides the writing, really the most labor-intensive thing. So I found data that I use for figures primarily from peer-reviewed literature. I snooped through data archives like Data Dryad. I sometimes had contacted authors for their raw data, and I also came to love this tool called WebPlot Digitizer, which allows you to extract data from actual graphs, so you can give it back to the students to create their own graphs. You can also find lots of illustrations that you can use for open access purposes on Wikimedia, photographs on Flickr. Google is an excellent search tool there because you can actually search images by usage rights. So you can search for images about human evolution and then say, only show me the images that actually are available under a license that I can actually use it for my own book. And so in the beginning, I was able to cobble together lots of resources. Over the past few months, I ended up redoing a lot of these illustrations and basically using Illustrator to make my own illustrations, just to give it a more consistent look and feel, which was something that the initial round of people were not super happy about. So this is kind of how I went about creating the textbook. So how do the students engage with it? Well, so my class is structured into weekly modules. There's essentially one topic per week. And before any module starts, the online textbook essentially provides students just an opportunity to do some basic reading about the basic concepts we're going to discuss. One of the more unique things about the book is that any graph that you will see in the book will actually come with the raw data. So any visualization of data, students can click on the data link that is in the figure caption. And the intent there is really for them to have an opportunity to look at the data and retrace the steps of how these figures were formed. And then the book also provides just basic R tutorials. So I have integrated literally how to use different commands in R, for example, how to make a simulation of genetic drift and get an output out of that. And that allows students essentially to work along and learn how these graphs are made. And every week, they essentially get an exercise that they have to do in R, where they either simulate some data, or in a case like here, they actually just visualize some data that I provide them with. And so they go in, and before the second class reading, they essentially do some homework. They make their figures. They're trying to understand what these figures mean, and they provide some written interpretations, like kind of a short version of a results and discussion section in a paper. And they do this every week for every module. And then on the second class period, we essentially get back together, and the students mostly work in groups to compare their results, compare their interpretations of the data, and provide them with some reflection questions, which are also part of the book. And at the very end, I just lecture a little bit to make sure that everybody kind of got the same take-home messages. So I tried really to have this book resource as their constant companion, from the introduction to an introduction to the exercise, to kind of the code they need to learn, to kind of the guiding questions that they should be thinking about as they're interpreting the data, so that they have a one-stop shop, and they don't have to pull together resources from different places. One thing I will say is that this can be really challenging for students. Like learning a new programming language kind of on the side in a course that is on an entirely different topic is not easy. And it comes often with a fair bit of anxiety among these students. And I've tried to address that essentially by eliminating high stakes assessments. There's no classical exams. Students get judged essentially by the work they put into the weekly exercises. They get feedback on all of these, and they can revise the exercises based on that feedback. I don't care whether they get it right on the first time or the second time or the third time. The important thing is that they get it right eventually. And kind of this approach to assessing student learning really was inspired by this recently published book called Ungrading that I recommend to all of you. It's a great book to think about how do we really try to understand what our students learn, and how do we really align what we expect them to do with the way they're assessed at the end of the course. In terms of some advice, if you want to author your own textbook, number one is leverage your own students. They're a fantastic resource. They know what they need to learn in order to move to careers they're interested in. They have very strong opinions of what they're interested in and what not. And working with them to figure out what they're excited about definitely makes for a more interesting product at the end. Also learn to leverage their expertise. So I use some of my funds that I received from K-State, for example, to pay a few past students that have taken my course, and I paid them to read it and tell me where does it make sense and where does it not make sense. They were also exceptionally good at finding my grammatical mistakes and typos, and so leveraging their expertise is a really good way to keep them engaged and make your product better. And then last but not least, I also like to say that, making your resources accessible beyond your immediate university, I think is really, really important. Because what I've learned over the past few months is that my students ended up not being the biggest users of the resource I created. Sometimes in late October or early November, Google picked up on this, and since then, I get about 1,000 unique monthly users that use the resource. I've gotten emails from students from, I think, about a half a dozen countries. There's 2 instructors in other countries that are interested in adopting this resource too. So keep in mind, you're not only doing this for yourself and your own students, but potentially for a much wider audience. So with this, I just wanted to thank a few people, especially financial support through the Open and Alternative Textbook Initiative. If you have any questions for me, I'm available on Twitter or at tobler@kstate.edu. And yeah, I'd be happy to take any questions if you have any.
Thank you so much for this presentation. I see 2 questions. The first one is, and maybe I'm not, does one need a text, or is it TX
Tech.
compiler to create the equations?
No, this is fully integrated in R. So you only need to specify, for example, in a code snippet within R that you're now writing in Tech. And then as you export that, R automatically essentially formats your output to do that. So what you will do initially is that you install some R packages that facilitate that process. But if you install a package like Bookdown, for example, which is what I used, this is all done automatically.
Great. And the other question, I think it's going back with what you ended with about people accessing the resources like in other countries, in other places. I think somebody asked the question, do they pay to use it?
No, I make this freely available to anyone. As you just clicked on the link, anybody can do so. I also make the kind of the code files that underlie this whole thing openly accessible for other users. So if there's other instruction out there that say, oh, this is kind of a cool resource, but I'd like to have this chapter or not that, they can modify it on their own. So this is completely free, completely openly available to edit, modify, share, however people see fit.
That's awesome. I have another question. It says, love your use of RStudio. Are you getting any credit towards P&T for creating this textbook?
No, of course not. No, I think it's appreciated, but honestly, I do it not for my colleagues. I do it for the students, and I tell you what, the students absolutely love it. Right? They love that they don't have to pay. They love that they can have input, and although they hate in the beginning that I make them learn how to program, they all walk out and say, you know what I learned in this class is how to program. And I would say about 80 or 90% actually love the fact that they learned that at the end. I'm also a tenured, so I would have never undertaken a project like that pre-tenure, because I know it probably wouldn't weigh positively the way a handful of papers would. And so part of this is definitely the privilege that comes with tenure and provides you with some time to actually do these type of things.
That's awesome. And somebody mentioned, how are you or might be using the international usage of your OER for promotion and tenure then?
Yeah, I probably won't. To me, it's important that the resource is available. Like, this was created in the spirit of openness, right? And if these textbooks are too expensive for our own students here, one of the countries in the world that has the highest levels of income, then most certainly they will alleviate some of that strain, or in terms of access to resources in other countries as well. And that's the spirit behind this, I think.
And if I could jump in, so on the topic of promotion and tenure and textbooks. So both of my books I actually wrote when I was an assistant professor, so it's tenure track. And I think part of what made it help for me was that I'm in a 70% teaching, 30% research appointment. And so it was beneficial to me to actually have teaching products that I could sort of put forward. And then in addition to that, I tried to get sort of two birds with one stone. So with both my books, I created a peer-reviewed journal article that was directly related to those books. And so it's not all effort that's going 100% into teaching. There's also sort of a peer-reviewed publication aspect to it as well. So
still need to do that.
But I had the encouragement of my department though too. So it was I would definitely check with your fellow faculty and department head before doing a project like this.
That's great. Thanks for sharing that. That's good to know. And somebody asked, can you integrate this into LMS like Canvas or Blackboard?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand that.
Sure. It says, can you integrate this into any LMS system such as Canvas or Blackboard?
So no, it's kind of an independent website. That said, I host all the assignments on the website and essentially just use the external URL feature in Canvas to link out to those assignments. So yeah, there's some modest integration that is possible. But one thing that other kind of platforms can do really well, and I have not figured out how to do in ours. For example, have interactive quizzes that when the students take it, automatically log their progress on Canvas. I don't think it's possible with this platform, but then also it's kind of a crazy platform where a lot of things are possible that I don't know about, but I have not tried this. For me, it was more important to have kind of this one concise place where things are at. And the only thing students really do on Canvas for my class is submit their weekly assignment, and that's about it.
Great. And I think there's just one quick question before we end the session that says, what's the cost of RStudio or Book Down? And somebody said that RStudio is free, but do you want to add any to that?
Yeah, R, the programming language, is free. RStudio is basically a way to easily work with R. That's also free. Book Down is a package that runs in R, and that's free as well. So none of these resources cost anything. There's also great kind of learning resources, like online books, essentially made in Book Down, and how to learn Book Down. I'd be happy if you're interested. Shoot me an email. I'll be happy to share those resources with you. But yeah, this is created using open access tools for essentially creating an open access textbook.
Great. Thank you so much. I think that's the last question. Somebody just commented that said some institutions like Pittsburgh State have chosen to count OER development towards promotion and tenure. So definitely check with your institutions
awesome.
about that for sure. But there's no other questions in the chat. If you have any other questions, please feel free to follow up with our speakers. We enjoy your session. Thank you so much for attending, and hope you attend the rest of the sessions today and tomorrow. Thank you so much. We learned so much from you. We appreciate it. And so now I'm going to stop the recording. Thank you.